Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Careers Unlocked, Professional Services. What does the corporate sector have to offer young people? My name is Sean. I'm the programme lead for EY Foundation in the North, which means that I get to work with young people directly. For those of you that don't know, the EY Foundation is an independent charity supporting young people on free school meals to get paid work experience, employability skills training, and career guidance to heighten their opportunities in the world of work. We do this through a variety of programs and partnerships, and we're also supporting social entrepreneurs as well. Like previous episodes, we have invited two wonderful guests to join us today and take us through the dynamic and ever-growing sector of professional services. We're going to explore what kind of jobs and companies the professional services industry includes and how the industry has changed over the years. We'll hear from our industry expert on what challenges and opportunities the sector poses for young people and learn from our young person how they view the sector, what they're impressed by, and what they think could change. Also, in recognition of Race Equalities Week, our guest will explore some of the changes happening in the industry since the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020, the progress made, and the work still to be done. So, to begin, I'm pleased to welcome our first guest, Olivia Agbe. Olivia is a student of history and politics at the London School of Economics, a public speaker, and a curator. She is passionate about the education, employment, and empowerment of young people and uses her lived experiences to support the work she does. In 2021, she was awarded Youth Ambassador of the Year by the EY Foundation, and she currently sits on the Foundation's Youth Advisory Board. Quite an introduction for someone at the age of 19. Hello, Olivia. How are you doing today?
Hi, Sean. I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. We are also today joined by Mona Bitar. Mona has worked in professional services for 25 years. She is the current Vice Chair at EY UK&I, where she works with some of EY's largest consumer accounts. Most recently, she was the Managing Partner for the consumer industry and has previously led EY's Reshaping Results offering and was the EY COVID-19 Client Response Leader. Before that, she oversaw the EY UK&I strategy practice and the products and services market for consulting services. So when it comes to professional services, this is definitely the person to speak to. Mona is a Palestinian, Jordanian, Lebanese Brit who completed her education in the UK and then decided to make it her home. She also has a PhD in politics from the University of Nottingham. And increasingly, Mona believes business has a bigger role to play in supporting society. Welcome, Mona. How are you doing today?
Thank you. Absolutely delighted to be here and lovely to meet you as well, Olivia.
Thank you so much. Okay, so to start off the conversation, we want to be thinking about professional services. And first, I'd be interested to hear from you both on what professional services means to you. So, Olivia, perhaps you could go first.
So, for me, professional services at the moment is playing quite a big part in life because I'm in my penultimate year of university and I'm learning more about what this industry can do for me, whether that's finding a job in the industry or just finding out specifically whether it's consulting, law, that kind of stuff, what I'm interested in. But also, as a young person, and especially after the pandemic, employment opportunities and understanding of what we can do when we leave university has been a big thing. So I think the pandemic tied in with being in my final years of university has made this industry more prevalent for me and more significant, and I'm researching more about it.
That's really interesting, and I think you've picked up on quite an important thing there. You mentioned consulting, law. There are so many different functions and areas to think about. So thank you for sharing that. Mona, you've been working in the sector for 25 years. What do you think is the biggest selling point of the professional services industry for young people, and what excites you about the sector?
Well, let me touch on a couple of things. I mean, as you've both just said, the sector is very, very diverse, right the way through from accounting, consulting, technology, law, etc. I've worked particularly in the kind of consulting advisory M&A space over the course of my career around it. And I think what's really interesting is, I much like you, Olivia, I studied history and politics at university, and I carried on to do a PhD, largely because I had no choice. It was the only legal way to stay in the country, and I wanted to remain in the UK. But then when I was given the view that I could stay and got my indefinite leave, I was looking for jobs. And actually, what appealed to me at the time was the fact that a lot of professional services organizations will give you the training that you need. You don't necessarily have to have a certain set of qualifications necessarily into going to it. Now, that might be different in some areas like law, but even in accounting, obviously, you can go and do your accounting training within professional services. So for me, it was the opportunity to learn. And what I've learned in the 25, I think it's more than 25 years now, actually, is the diversity of it and the fact that you can apply yourself to many different things. So I started in an operational boutique consulting firm, which was very much around manufacturing and process and how things work. And that was invaluable to me. And I wasn't an engineer, and I was surrounded by people who were engineers, but I wasn't, but I could still contribute. Now, for me, I think my interest in that side of things sort of waned a little bit, probably because I wasn't an engineer. And that's when I made my first move into the Big Four. And then I got much more interested in M&A, mergers and acquisitions, and the wider business agenda and private equity. These were all terms that I didn't even know existed. Even in my first 8 years of working, I had so little knowledge. So, I got into that space, into the Big Four, and I worked on a lot of transactions and learnt a lot. And again, I'm not a financially qualified person by background. So again, but I was able to contribute quite a lot in that space on operational matters, which by then I had quite a lot of knowledge on from my 8 years experience. And then I moved into more of a sector and got into the consumer sector. So what appeals to me is the constant learning, the ability to be able to problem solve. I think it's the most privileged job in the world in a way. You get to work with so many different clients. You work with some of the best companies in the world, and you get to partner with them on solving their most complex problems, but also their complex aspirations as you look forward. And I've moved so many times. I've worked in 3 companies, and within those 3 companies, I've had different roles in so many places. So I think that variety really appeals to me. So I think if you're a young person not quite sure what you want to do, but like problem solving, the industry is just getting wider and wider, as challenges in the world change. It's got broader, there's more convergence. You can cover sustainability, you can cover technology, you can cover diversity, you can cover all sorts of things.
Thanks for that, Mona. I think that's probably, one of the most appealing things about the industry. Like you said, that you can move around, and a lot of young people might think that you have to get into one job and that's it, but that's totally not the case. There's always different things to explore as you go through your career. Olivia, for you, you're currently studying at LSE. What has been your interaction to date, if any, with the professional services sector? Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So I think I came into contact with the professional services industry when I started sixth form. So our careers advisor had basically told us to look for work experience, and that began with looking at different firms, looking at the kind of things we were interested in. And whilst the pandemic did happen during my first year of sixth form, I was able to secure a spot on EY Foundation's Smart Futures program. And through that program, I learned a lot more about what EY itself does, what the foundation does, and what myself as an individual studying A levels could do in the sector. And I hadn't really thought about that before. I'd dabbled in whether I wanted to do law, whether I wanted to study politics, and just hadn't had a concrete answer to what I wanted to do. But doing that program gave me an idea of what was available to me, and I spoke to so many different EY employees about the work they were doing, I had a mentor for 10 months as well who was able to assist me with so many different stuff, whether that's my applications towards university or just personal timetable kind of stuff. So that was my first proper interaction with the professional services industry. And from that, I was just able to build a relationship with the foundation and build my understanding of what work goes on in there and if I could see myself there as well.
Nice. It sounds like you've had quite a lot of experience almost so far at such a young age. And you just touched on moving to university there. And since transitioning from school to university, what have you found has been the biggest change or difference for you?
Um, I think this is quite common amongst students, but it's definitely the independence that's required because sixth form, in a way, coddles you and it doesn't really give you that environment where you're just free to do what you want to do. When I went to university, there was a lot of independence. I had to be the one attending my classes without attendance worries. I was the individual that had to do just all of the work on my own, and that is expected from university, but especially moving to another city and the independence away from home, that was another thing. But it's something that I was able to take in my stride and just really enjoy being able to be in London and to explore the different career options available to me, meeting so many different individuals because my university is 70% international students. So I was meeting so many different types of people. So I would definitely say it's the independence, but that's something that I really am enjoying.
Nice. I'm really glad that you're enjoying it, and I'm glad that you're able to take such a relatively big transition all in your stride. Do you feel that having gone through that move from school to university, you can apply that kind of experience and anything you've learned to perhaps what would be your next big transition, i.e., entering the workplace? How do you think that might look?
I think that there are so many comparisons that I can make towards what I think it will be like transitioning to a corporate job or being in the professional services industry, especially with the independence and the proactiveness. Say if you go into a graduate job or something like that, you are going to be coached and trained. There's also a sense of you taking the initiative and making sure that you're proactive. So I think the things that I've learned transitioning from sixth form to university, I will definitely and can definitely apply to entering the industry. And like Mona said, in terms of the diversity of the industry, there's so much that I can learn from the people around me. And that's something that I think going forward I'll be using, trying to take nuggets from everyone that I meet and learning from their own experiences.
Absolutely. Put those networking skills to the test and get as much as you can from all the people that you meet. I think that's a really nice piece of advice for everyone to take away from this call. Um, Thank you for sharing that. And keeping on the topic of change and transitions, Mona, over the course of your career, what key trends can you identify as generating the biggest change?
Oh, that's a big question, Sean.
Hmm.
I think there's been a few. If I look at the course of my career, the first big one that jumps to mind is the role of technology in the sector. So I think professional services, if you go back way back into history, was much more sort of in the financial, tax or law kind of space, and increasingly, you know, the impact of technology that's had on all of that, including consulting, has been massive. And so the ability to become more literate, which was quite daunting, I have to say, and I wouldn't say I'm anywhere near a tech specialist in any shape or form, but I've become a little bit more fluent around that. And I think, I remember my overriding fear when this happened was am I going to still be able to be relevant given my skill set, where I came from, because so much of the world now revolves around technology. But I think, as with all of these big disruptive trends, I think as long as you continue to learn, you go through it. So that, I think, has been a big change around it. I think the second big change, which I think is really important if I take a slightly longer time frame, is, particularly if I focus on kind of the consulting advisory side of professional services, which has been my experience, is, at the beginning of my career, you worked with a lot of companies that perhaps didn't have people who were qualified in the same way as consultants. So they didn't have strategists, they didn't necessarily have MBA students, etc. So they were looking for their professional services firms to supplement their capability with that advice. But actually, over the last 25 years, companies are employing all sorts of people. So actually, the requirement on the industry has become even more depth of knowledge, depth of sector, content advice around it, which in some ways has been really refreshing because it forces you to go deeper into understanding the issues and really understanding how can you add value to your client, because if you're not adding value, it's a very short-lived career. Because certainly my experience has been a lot of my clients have been repeat clients over many years, and the way you build that trusted relationship is really important. The third change has been actually around the diversity of the sector. Um, I'm old enough to remember being about the only woman in every room that I worked in for years and years and years, which, it's not the most comfortable of situations where you don't have that. But if I look now, we're nowhere near perfect, by the way, but on the gender basis, at least there are far more females active in the professional services industry now than there ever were. And I think that's been a massive change, and a change for the better, because actually you get a lot more diversity in the way of thinking. So those are a few, but there's been many. It's an ever evolving industry which you have to keep pace with.
Thanks for sharing them, Mona. And to be honest, they all sound like very positive changes, and especially touching on the first one on tech. That's something that our young people can be doing themselves before they've even come into the world of employment. They can be upskilling themselves. So I think it's a very important thing to take on board. So thinking about the fact that I've just mentioned, it's Race Equality Week last week. That was from the 6th to the 13th of February. EY Foundation, along with a host of other organisations, took part in Race Equality Week, and that is a UK-wide initiative that aims to unite thousands of organisations and individuals to address race equality barriers in the workplace. This was in part driven by the events of 2020, including the Black Lives Matter movement and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on ethnic minority communities. The public's consciousness of race inequality has been heightened, and the job sector, professional services included, like Mona just mentioned, has been responding to this in different ways. The theme for Race Equality Week 2023 was hashtag it's everyone's business, to highlight that tackling race inequality is everyone's business and responsibility. So Olivia, with the focus on the recent Race Equalities Week, I'd be interested to know how the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020 particularly impacted you and your peers.
Thank you. So, if I look back to the hashtag you just said, it's everyone's business, I think it's really important for us to go off of that and remember that since 2020, there's been a lot of commitment made and a lot of understanding that racism and microaggression, there's no tolerance for it in the workplace. But I think it's also important for us to still highlight the individuals that are still working in organizations to ensure that DEI is at the center, to ensure that diversity is at the center of firms, at the center of their policies and stuff like that. I think for myself and my peers, especially at university, it's been highlighted to us that diversity is also a thing that needs to be considered there as well. So I don't think it's just one place where diversity, equity, and inclusion is important. I think it's transpires across all of the sectors of our life. And I think it's really important for us to look back at what happened, look back at the protests that happened and the commitments that were made, and not move away from that, try and work towards that. And though it may be challenging, still having these conversations and ensuring that we acknowledge what we did promise is really important.
Thank you for sharing that, Olivia. I think you've raised some really good and important points there, especially the one that this, is across all aspects of what you do, not just the workplace. It does apply to university education, just everyday life. So I think that's a really important takeaway for people. Mona, you touched on diversity as well when you're talking about big changes and how that's come into the workplace. What would you say the impact of the movement was in the professional services industry, and what change did it bring about for race equity in the workplace?
Yeah, so thank you, Sean and Olivia. It was lovely to hear what you were talking about just then. I think it's really important that it is everyone's business. And, at EY, we already had a strong foundation because for a number of years we had differentially focused on race and gender. In terms of trying to change our representation within EY, but actually after the Black Lives Matters movement, etc., and we did a whole load of listening sessions with some of our Black colleagues, and they told us very clearly that it wasn't enough and that we needed to go beyond looking at ethnicity as one group. I think we got a bit lazy actually looking at BAME, which actually is not the lived experience of different things. So what have we done? Well, the first thing is we've kind of avoided that category of BAME because I think it's a bit meaningless. And we've started to use the UK census categories to really start understanding both Black and other representation, because you think you might be doing well on one aspect, but it's not necessarily. And I think on Black representation there was a specific gap that we had which we need to address and work harder. I think Asian is a higher representation than Black, just to give you an example. We also look at that now in our pay gap review. We make sure that we look at that. We've invested heavily in our race fluency training. I think a lot of people are just frightened to talk about some of the race issues because they're frightened of getting a foot wrong. Are they going to say the wrong thing? Are they, and actually we've got to have the conversations. It's a very underdeveloped narrative, and so we've got to increase people's literacy around this. And then obviously the whole culture of belonging, which is something that ties, and we refreshed our diversity strategy recently and we included equity in that. And equity is really important. And, underpinning that is belonging. And the way I think about it, and people have heard me talk about this a lot, is the antonym to belonging is distance. So the more distances there are, the less you belong. So how do we close those distances? By understanding them and understanding the lived experience of people around that. So, these are some of the things. We as EY, and I'm the EY representative also on the Parker Review, which you'll know is about increasing the level of ethnic minority on boards. And that's really important because we know the impact of role models that have for people. If you can't see someone like yourself, it makes it harder. So that's a really important aspect of representation, both bottom up and top down. So those are some of the things. Look, we're nowhere near there. There's so much more to do, but I think people are getting much more comfortable talking about race and talking about the wider diversity, equity agenda. And if we can't talk about it, we're not going to change it. So we've got to get people to be able to have those conversations.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's really leads quite nicely on to my next question, the point that you've made on there has been positive changes and positive work done, but of course there is always more to do. With all that in mind and the great work that has been done so far, it would be good to consider what each of you might like to see next. So for you, Olivia, as a university student who will be entering the workforce relatively soon, what support might you like to see from employers in the professional services industry to help you on that journey?
Thank you so much, Mona. I agree with everything you just said. I think that if I take it back to before university, I think just having an individual from EY or from the EY Foundation coming into school and speaking to young people themselves at my sixth form really impacted us and really allowed us to set our sights on working in the corporate world or working in the professional services industry. So I think that intervention from way before we get to university will be great so that we have an understanding of what this sector is for individuals who may not have family members who work in the professional services industry, who might not have gone to university and things like that. Having that introduction to it before they make these choices and make these decisions could be that little bit different between them deciding it's a place for them and deciding that they fit in there. But if I look to myself now at university, I think something that would help would definitely be I guess, support regarding applications and stuff like that. And I think this is something that's available to young people such as myself, because I think at times young people, and myself included, can feel a bit, it can feel a bit daunting applying for roles or graduate roles, and feeling as though potentially I'm not qualified to do this, or it's not relating specifically to my degree. How will I ensure that I still stand out as a good candidate? So I think just the application processes, they've been made a lot more accessible, but actually having time to sit down with maybe an EY employee or somebody who has gone through that stage to guide someone through that. And I know there are so many different schemes that currently do that, but it would be great to have more, and it'd be great for younger students than myself to also have those opportunities. And then also just in terms of witnessing the diversity and witnessing the inclusion that Mona was talking about. So especially with the Parker Review and the idea that more boards should have more diversity, I think being able to see yourself in the firm that you want to work in has a big impact on whether you want to go there, whether you want to work there. So I think being able to recognize and see people that look like you in firms would be great. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's something that's going to have to take time and develop. But I think that's something that a lot of firms and a lot of companies should be working towards, and working towards training up the young people to become those individuals who will sit on boards.
Wow, some really, really good points there, Olivia. Really appreciate you sharing that. Olivia, since you're a young person and we have a professional services expert here, I want to give you the opportunity. Is there any questions that you would like to ask Mona directly yourself?
Yes, please. Thank you. So I think something that's really interesting and something that young people are coming across more is this idea between equality and equity. And I wondered if potentially for any young people listening, you could kind of explain why that's so important and how EY itself is working towards that.
Thanks, Olivia. I mean, that's a really insightful question. And I don't know, many of you will have seen there's been a number of illustrations, I think, that would do a much better job of describing the difference between equality and equity on a number of bases. And I always like the one of people of, different backgrounds heading to a start line on a race. And if you happen to have had an education, if you've happened to have, you get 2 steps forward. And just by sort of staggering people around it, does that mean that you give them equality or equity? So for me, equity is about the importance of everyone having the same opportunity to do as much as they can with it. And that's much more important to me. And it's about providing the opportunities for them. So we know today that there isn't equity in everything we do. There isn't equity in the same opportunities for people. Let me give you a little bit of a sort of maybe bad example, but nonetheless, I'll give it to you. A number of years ago, internships were very much focused about who you know. So different parents would necessarily secure internships for their children or their children's friends. Naturally, they will all probably have come from the same socioeconomic background because it was that circle who was offering internships for people who didn't have those opportunities. Where's the equity in that? Now the internship program is far better in terms of allowing people. So that's been a great move, for example, of how you change from into real equity by providing the opportunities for people from any background to be able to access some of those internships, etc. Look, I mean, we've a long way to go on equity, and I'll go back to the belonging because I feel very strongly about belonging. You've got to be able to be your authentic self at work, and you've got to be able to contribute the value that you can contribute. And you're never going to do that if you don't feel you're in a safe environment. So, how do you create the safe environment that anyone of whatever background can contribute is really about getting to true equity, in my view.
Thanks for sharing that, Mona. And you've talked about the changes that have happened, and you also mentioned there's a lot of plans to do more. So, what kind of plans do EY have to continue to remove barriers for young people entering the workplace?
I mean, change doesn't happen overnight, but it's about accessibility, in order to get that equitable kind of range of options. And there's no one size fits all. So what have we done at EY? We now have a range of options for people, whether it's a school leaver program, whether it's graduates, whether it's apprenticeships. We run two programs which you may be aware of, obviously Discover EY Black Heritage in Business and Discover EY Women in Leadership. Both of these are providing students with experiences and network opportunities in order to really feel what it's like to work at EY. We're also really committed to being the employer of choice for young people, and we're collaborating with Jack Parsons, who's the CEO of the youth group, to achieve our youth verified status. And that will be about helping young people thrive, and it will be an industry-leading accreditation around building trust between young people and employees. But, despite all of these specific things, if I could wrap it all up into one thing, it's about leadership. And, we've got to convince anyone in a leadership position to really open up to this conversation and really understand what it means, because it's going to be the small actions that everyone takes that's actually going to change the dial in a very big way. And so I believe really strongly in storytelling. So one of the things I'm doing is a whole host of activities with clients and internally to get people to share their lived experience, whether that's about ability, whether it's about race, whether it's about gender, so that people actually become much more educated around some of the barriers or distances, is what I like to call them, so that we can start to close them and create more equity. But it takes everyone in a leadership position to stand back and think about it. And look, people sometimes don't, not because they don't care, but they're so busy with their day job and what's going on that they don't realize. But for me, if we're going to change the world, we've got to focus on the pipeline. And the pipeline are people Olivia's age and coming up. Because actually, you're the guys who are going to really change this industry over time. And we've got to equip you with everything that we can, that you can do that as quickly as possible.
Thank you for that, Mona. Again, all really good points. And normally at this point in the episode, we hand over to our expert to go in more depth. Is there anything that you would like to add to what you've already said when it comes to what employers can do to drive racial equity for their employees, or around actions or work that young people can look for in employers to demonstrate they are taking the necessary steps to minimise inequality and drive racial equity? Is there anything you'd like to add on that from an expert perspective?
First of all, I think we've all got to understand the lived experience. I've said that before and I'll say that again. So if I take, race and ethnicity in particular, I think we've got to understand that throughout the employee life cycle. And that means we've got to collect ethnicity data, because we've got to be able to measure and understand what's happening with those representative groups. Now, collecting data is quite hard because it requires self-identification. And interestingly, actually, we at EY in the UK have a very high rate, I think it's in the 90s, in terms of people self-identifying either their ethnicity or disability or whatever. But in other companies, it can be as low as 30 and 40%. And the reason around that is trust. People aren't sure what you're going to do with the data. So how do you actually start to build the trust around self-identification? And then what do you do with that data? Because when we have the data, it's really important to say, well, look, why is that happening? Why is there a pay gap? How can you be meaningful about pay gap if 50% of your population hasn't self-identified? It will be meaningless. Or in professional services, we look, for example, at utilization, people who are on jobs. We know if our teams are utilized or not utilized. Now, because we have much better gender diversity data, we can look and say, is there one particular group that's underutilized more than another? Maybe. If there is, why is that? Can we dig deeper? Can we fix that? So I think that's quite important. So look, I think you need to dig deep in these issues. These are not surface issues. And I think if we really want to tackle diversity, equity, and inclusion, we've got to be prepared to dig deep. What are the meaningful changes that are going to change people's lived experience? And that means you've got to hear from young people as well. Because my mental model, and I do this a lot with gender and ability, which are both things that I lived through. But on the gender side of things, just to give you an example, what it took when I was in my 20s is not what it is now. And similarly, on ability, which I think, by the way, is one of the least well understood aspects of equality in the workplace, and considering about 1 in 5 people have some form of ability challenge, we don't even know that. And sometimes I'm a bit critical and say, since disabled toilets and ramps, what have we actually done in the workplace to make life better? Now, we at EY have launched our Neurodiverse Centre, which I think is a great step forward, but that's one aspect. But what are we doing in the environment to make it more equitable for people who are vision impaired, hearing impaired? They have a lot to contribute. So I've waffled on a little bit, Sean, but I think for me, dig deep, get into the underlying issues, and don't be frightened to face into them head on.
Absolutely. Again, I just agree with everything that you said, and I really like the way that you are raising different challenges around different groups of people, and I think that's really important. So thank you, Mona, for your input. Okay, so we're nearly at the end of the episode, but before we say goodbye to our 2 excellent guests, I wanted to check in with Olivia and ask for any final thoughts. How are you feeling now after the discussion? Did anything surprise you, or is there anything particular that jumped out at you that you want to make sure that people take away?
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Mona. Something that just kind of popped into my head was the idea of intersectionality in the workplace, and just hearing Mona talk about potentially like someone having a disability, but then also add onto that them being a woman, and then add onto that them being a person of color. There's a lot of different things that that person will need in the workplace, and they may not always feel comfortable to ask for that or know where to start. So I think these conversations aren't just important for us to like think about, they're important for someone's comfortability and, like Mona said, belonging in the workplace. It's really going to affect how people feel comfortable and feel like they are a part of the team and they're a valued member of the place they're working in. So I think not only is it a great conversation, but it's kind of someone's lives and their livelihood and their way of working. So that's something that I wanted to say. But also the lived experience side of things, I think from my own experience and hearing from my peers, lived experience and understanding someone's lived experience will have a big impact in work in the future, and it's going to support the ever-changing environment of the professional services industry, because by understanding where someone's coming from, their background, and potentially what they've gone through, I think we're going to have a lot more empathy for people in the workplace and see how their skills will elevate the workplace. But I think taking on lived experience and understanding that everyone has a story, but everybody is here in the workplace to work together and do a really good job is really important. And last thing I'd like to say is I'm really excited for the future of the professional services industry. Like Mona said, young people, they're really paving a different way and paving a different understanding of what work could be, whether that's hybrid working, whether that's the use of technology. I think there's so much for us to learn from those before us, but also for us to bring to the table and to diversify the ways that we are working in the professional services industry. So I'm really looking forward to see what happens and how we can work together, basically.
Wow, thank you so much, Olivia. I mean, that was the perfect wrap up in my opinion, and it's been so amazing to speak to both of you today. You brought so much value to the conversation, and I'm sure anyone listening will have been able to take away some really, really good advice and some really good points for them to think about a little further. So from myself and from everyone at the EY Foundation, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your week. For anyone listening, make sure that you look out for the next episode of the podcast. Thank you so much.